Okay, about new short stories. The piece itself, as the title suggests, is written in a way that reflects my uh, literary disposition, I would say, and as such, it moves from left to right. It's a piece that I literally began with a single gesture and continued exploring what that gesture meant and what the repercussions of that gesture could be in a narrative kind of way. And it's very hard for me to not understand music as anything but some kind of a narrative. I know it's possible to create art in a number of different ways and to create music following structures that are not necessarily narrative. But for my music and for the music that I appreciate, uh, a sense of teleology and a sense of question and response and a sense of consequence and a certain plot, a musical plot, is essential for my understanding of the piece. So in this particular work, I did it. I suppose I took that notion a bit more literally and more liberally, and decided to write a short story, musical short story with no specific plot, but with these concepts of again, question and response, consequence, etc., at the fore of my thinking. I was thinking, as I often do, about the words of Italo Calvino, who is one of the short story writers, short storytellers that I most admire, at least among relatively recent writers. And not only did he write some phenomenal short stories and short novels, but he also spoke very eloquently about what writing an effective short story would be. And he says things that have to do with what he calls quickness. He says that above all, agility, mobility, and ease are the components of quickness in a good narrative. He says this, and I took that as my key. I decided to create a first gesture and then proceed with what I consider to be agility, mobility, and ease. Again, not in a literal sense, but just keeping that as some kind of general idea to follow through my piece. I wrote almost no sketches for this composition. I will share with you, I will share my screen and show you the one, uh, really the one sketch there is for this piece. And I have to say that this piece was originally entitled Short Stories, or rather its original version is called Short Stories. And then I revised it and expanded it and reorchestrated it and turned it into new short stories. And then I went back to the original short stories and reorchestrated that original version as well. And that became Short Stories 2. But they all are based on the same basic material, although each of them follows this plot, so to speak, in a slightly different way, because they are like three different ways to tell the same story. Not unlike the famous In the Grove by I'm blanking on the author, the Japanese author of Rashomon. Akutagawa, that's his name. Anyway, back to short stories. It all began with what you see on your screen now, which says Cuba Libre. And this is because the original short stories was written for a friend of mine who is a Cuban-American pianist. And it was conceived from the get-go as some kind of concertante piece, a piece that would prominently display the piano in the context of an orchestral environment. So this is a pianist who was born in the United States, of Cuban descent, and as such has the kind of uneasy relationship with what the island of Cuba means. She desperately misses the Cuban culture and embraces the Cuban culture, but at the same time, she has all these misgivings about what the political situation is in Cuba and about what the United States has done to Cuba to a great part dismantle what Cubans ultimately wanted to build, which was a socialist republic. So the idea of Cuba Libre, which of course is also a tongue-in-cheek expression denoting the drink, that has Coca-Cola and rum, which is in and out of itself, representative of what I'm talking about. This drink that has, the imperialistic Coca-Cola and the quintessential Cuban drink mixed. And it's called Cuba Libre, is fascinating. So Cuba Libre represents this ambivalence, okay? And as such, I think I was just kind of playing with it, and I took this soggetto cavato, which is this collection of pitches based on a pair of words, and played them, and then that's what Cuba Libre represents as a soggetto cavato. And I like the fact that one goes down and the other one goes up. When I observed this, I decided to interlock them, and that of course gave me a chromatic scale descending, in which Cuba and Libre are kind of interlocked. And I like the fact that they're interlocked because metaphorically, that's precisely what I think my friend Cristina Valdez, the Cuban pianist, was experiencing. And then I arranged this in yet one more form, which is what gives us the third little example there at the top of the page. And that gave me the motif that the whole piece ultimately was going to explore, which is the Cuba Libre motif. And then you see the piano part underneath. And you can see that it is basically a set of rotations of and permutations of that same motive, with some changes, of course. Like the E flat at the beginning was turned into an E natural because it sounded better to me. And it begins, tentatively, as if telling a story. I say the first phrase, then I wait. I say it again in a slightly different way, and I wait. Of course, there's stuff happening in the ensemble while this pianist is waiting, and then I expand a little bit on it and reach yet one more destination, and then I dismantle the entire thing when these low notes come in, and then the piece kind of starts over again, and the story begins to unfold. So that is a long-winded explanation of how this piece came about and why it has this quality of a narrative. As for the constant 16th notes, well, that's just how I write music. All of my music uses pulsation, and where that comes from, and a regular pulsation that is somehow disturbed in a number of ways and manipulated in a number of ways, where that comes from is probably a complex answer that has to do with the fact that I, like Mozart, that my first great experience with what we call new music was with Stravinsky's Concerto for Two Piano Solos. and Bartok's Sonata for two pianos and percussion. It was literally at the same time, because those two pieces were recorded on opposite sides of an LP that I had access to, played by the Kontarsky brothers, and really hearing these two pieces showed me the way. I heard the Stravinsky and the Bartok, and I thought, this is the kind of stuff that I would like to be doing. And I thought it was a great introduction to new music, because it showed me pieces that acknowledge not only the great Western tradition, but also their vernacular traditions as well, while also pointing in new directions. So it was a kind of gentle way into new music. And, I played rock and roll, and I played jazz, and as I said, Mozart was the great classical composer for me. So this idea of constant pulsation is there in the music that I've always loved, and that's really why my music operates this way.
Wow.
So this piece, Transforced Interludes, has a peculiar history to it. It is an independent work that could be performed and has been performed on its own for solo voice. It's dedicated to Tony Arnold. She asked for it. But the way it originated was, I have this piece, Kikai no Mori, which is a transcription of another piece of mine called Ex Machina for percussion and piano. That piece was played in Panama, of all places, once. And Tony was going to be there as part of the Soundscape Trio. And the Soundscape Trio without Tony was going to play as a duo this piece, Kikai no Mori. And in Panama, they had trouble printing the program notes for the piece. And that piece, Kikai no Mori, is based on pre-existing sculptures, most of them moving sculptures, kinetic sculptures. And the program notes are kind of important because they tell the story of each of the sculptures, and it makes it a little bit more clear what I was trying to do in the piece, which was to reflect on what I saw the sculptures do, at least the sculptures do to me emotionally. So I came up with the idea of inserting in between the movements of that piece, there are 8 movements in that piece, a text that somehow alluded to each of the sculptures that themselves inspired each of the movements. And I did it myself live, in performance. I read these texts and I try to be as much of a thespian as possible and act out these texts. And after I did it, it actually worked out really well. The performance was really fantastic, and people liked it. And Tony said, "Hey, why don't you turn this into something I could sing?" And we were going to meet later that year in Italy for another performance. So I decided very quickly to come up with these short interludes that would be accompanying Kikai no Mori initially. And I wrote these extremely quickly. I wrote them in just a few days, maybe shows. But the idea was that I would take texts from the various artists that inspired the piece, as well as there's an exception, which is the last one, and I would just turn them into vocalises or something like that. And again, it happened very quickly, pretty much from left to right. I took the text and I responded to it in the best way I could. The texts are a combination of somewhat poetic things that some of these artists say, something like follow the feeling of the piece, then wrestle it into being. That's something that Jean Tinguely, one of the sculptors, said about what he did with his works. Follow the feeling of the piece and then wrestle it into being. I love that dichotomy of following the feeling of the piece and then forcing your will on it. Then I read that Arthur Ganson, the other sculptor, said, I imagine myself as a machine. What would I love? I would love to be bathed in oil. And again, that's a beautiful idea, beautiful image. And I wrote a piece based on that. For the last poem, last intervention, I chose a poem that has nothing to do with the original piece. And it is a poem by Oliverio Girondo, an Argentinian modernist poet. He lived in the first half of the 20th century in Argentina. And he was part of a wonderful effervescence in not just poetry, but the arts in South America. Incredibly well read and also way ahead of his time. And he wrote extensively, and I have used his poetry in a number of pieces, and I will continue to use it. And actually, I'm in a work based entirely on his poetry is in the making as we speak. And this particular one that I chose is called the 12th poem, or Poema 12. And what I would like to do is I would like to again share my screen, if you will indulge with me, and I will show you something that you haven't seen, I don't think. It is a performance that Tony Arnold created of the interludes just recently while in confinement. She was supposed to participate in a festival in California, and because of COVID, she couldn't be there. So she recorded herself performing the program that she was going to do in California, and it included my piece. So it did the whole piece, but I'm going to show you just the last of the poems, the last of the texts. And I'm going to share my screen.
They admire, they desire, they gravitate. They caress, they undress, they osculate. They pant, they sniff, they penetrate. They weld, they meld, they conjugate. They sleep, they wake, they illuminate. They covet, they touch, they fascinate. They chew, they taste, they salivate, they tangle, they twine, they segregate. They languish, they lapse, they reintegrate, they wriggle, they squirm, they orchestrate. They fumble, they fondle, they punctuate, they swoon, they twitch, they resuscitate. They sulk, they pout, they contemplate. They ignite, they inflame, they incinerate, they erupt, they explode, they detonate. They nab, they grab, they dislocate. They clench, they clutch, they calcinate. They solder, they squeeze, they conflagrate, they shudder, they choke, they consecrate, they redden, they madden, they subjugate, they provoke, they claw, they assassinate. they levitate.
That's basically what it is, and that's really almost as much as I can say about this piece, because it was written very, very intuitively, very, very intuitively, and entirely following the feeling of the poems and then wrestling them into being, I'm calling them poems, although not all of them were actual poems. Okay, don't blame anyone um, is this what we call poetic opera, that, like most collaborative pieces, had a um, strange, sui generis origin. Um, the whole thing began basically with a short story by Julio Cortázar. Actually, I happen to have a book by Cortázar right here. He's another Argentine. This one lived later, and it has something in common with Girondo. I don't think they ever met, but there are similar explorations in their work. And I don't know if it's because Argentina is so far away from everything, but they really have a literary tradition that is unlike anything else. So this opera began with the short story by Cortázar. It's a short story where a man is late for an appointment. He's trying to leave his apartment and decides to put on a sweater because he senses a draft. And while putting on the sweater, he discovers that he can't. So the story is basically about him trying to put on this sweater, and the sweater, doesn't cooperate. And things get so complicated in the short story that he ends up falling out of a window and killing himself. And the title of that story is "Don't Blame Anyone," as one would read in a suicide note. Don't blame anyone of my death. So that was an idea that I had in mind for this, because not only because I loved the story and I loved Cortázar and I wanted to do something with it, but also because we were going to work with the Push Physical Theater, this company based in New York, in Rochester, that combines dance with acting and with very, very physical gymnastics. So I had this vision of that scene somehow being on stage. The idea of a man trying to put on a sweater and falling into his death. And that's really how it began. We had meetings with Darren and Ricardo Zon, who wrote the second half of the piece. And during these meetings, we would each bring material that we thought was pertinent for this work that didn't really exist and that had no plot or no other concept behind it, other than the fact that we knew that there was going to be this scene of a man climbing a stairs and then falling, and while trying to put on a sweater. And I found myself constantly bringing poems in different languages because I was looking everywhere. And that's one of the reasons why the piece is the entire piece is in more than one language, but specifically Spanish and English. Although in the process of creating this piece, I did bring poems in Italian and in French that I thought we maybe could have used. Also, here were Mexicans working with an Englishman, Darren Stevenson, who is the director of Push, in a place like Rochester for a project that was ultimately going to be presented in Mexico. So this idea of multicultural collaboration was there from the get-go. While, whenever I brought in a poem or a text or something like that, Darren in my living room would act it up, and he's so quick that he would immediately suggest to me what music would work for that. And that's really how this little by little, began to gain shape. So most of the poems that I ended up using are actually in Spanish. But for the prelude, which is important in this piece, I mixed a bunch of texts. Well, I didn't mix a bunch of texts. I talked to a friend of mine who happens to be Australian, but she's a polyglot. She speaks 7 languages beautifully. I asked her to help me with the text for the prelude to this thing. And she came up with something that resembles very much what we ended up using. I altered it quite a bit, but the essence of the text was hers. I have to say that the idea of this entire piece ultimately is the blank page, is the process of creation, of artistic creation, and the difficulties. And early in the process, I thought of an etching by Goya that is quite amazing, and it's a picture of somebody at a table that is being attacked by monsters, flying monsters that look like a combination between the bats and something perhaps more bizarre than a bat. And the title for that little etching is "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." El sueño de la razón produce monstruos in Spanish. And I remember being very, very young and seeing this etching and finding it absolutely mesmerizing, terrifying and mesmerizing. And I was exposed to very strange art, art that was not necessarily child friendly at a very young age for some reason, maybe because I'm the youngest of several siblings. So this was one such piece. And I thought immediately when we were talking about this work about that, the sleep of reason produces monsters. And I kind of extrapolated that concept to the process of creating a work of art. While you're creating a work of art, you are creating monsters, and monsters are coming at you and possessing you, and you're fighting them. And ultimately, the work of art is the result of that struggle between your inner monsters, the monsters of creativity, and the process of somehow making that into something worth showing to others. So that's why, ultimately the piece became a piece about the blank page and about the monsters of creation and the difficulty of creating. So going back to the prelude, I'm going to show it to you. So the text for the prelude is this, that you see, starting with the word stop. And again, this was created by Crystal Thornhill, this poet from Australia who is a polyglot. And again, it simply suggests the kind of mindset of an artist who is at the onset of creation and not quite knowing where to go. So stop, no, arrêtez in French. No, not the beginning. This isn't it. Stop, shh, not yet. Let's sleep, not the start. Todavía nada, nada, no bliss. So there's this sort of like stream of consciousness struggle, represented by this author. I think that because Crystal is a polyglot, she came up with something that mixed several languages that she knows. And then I just refined it, and I inserted bits that I got from a Petrarca poem, sonnet, that I thought was incredible. Is this sonnet called Beato in sogno e de languir contento. It's something like pure in sleep and resting happily, something like that. But which is translated here as blessed with sleep, to laziness resigned. I love that idea because it connected the Goya, original Goya title of an etching, with the concept of somehow being in a state that to which we resign ourselves. And also, really, what did it was the last bit of the sonnet, where he says, I swim in boundless, endless seas. I plow the waves. I build on sand. I write on the wind. Those metaphors and those oxymoronic metaphors, I thought were exactly what we were talking about when we were discussing the origins of this work. We work with material that is intangible. We plow the waves. We build on sand, and we write on the wind. That's what music is. Music is elusive, the way that these phrases are. So I thought I have to use it. So I interspersed that in the almost schizophrenic introduction, and then I continued with it and presented it in its full form. And then after that, all kinds of poems were eventually discarded and introduced, and they come from many, many different authors. Some are said in English, others are said in Spanish, and they all have to do in some capacity with, again, this notion of difficulty in art making. So, I'm just showing you some of these poems. At the center of the mill, we see the flame, and the present weaves its mysteries on a loom. To me, that's again a representation of the act of creating something in art. We're weaving the mysteries of our ideas on a loom. And yet, I love the fact that at the center of it all, there's a mill, and that there's fire. So these notions, all these visual concepts of a mill that is grinding something, of fire that is perhaps igniting it, and of all of it being part of some kind of a loom, which is this beautiful contraption that weaves something fragile and volatile. It's all there. So I want to go through all the texts, but suffice it to say that the use of different languages was not really something that I set out to doing. It is just what happened gradually when we collaborated for this piece, and it has more to do with where we come from. This idea of being an artist who grew up in a Spanish-speaking country but works in English. That's me, and I've had the opportunity to be in different places, different parts of the world, and I use language in general all the time. Not so much in my music because I don't write very much vocal music, but certainly in my thinking. I read. One of the good things about COVID is that it's given me a lot of time to read. So I'm spending a lot of time reading, and that's something I had not been able to do as much or as intensely as I wanted. So there's that. I don't know if I answered it, but I certainly talked a lot. And this all is connected to my conviction that for me, music is some sort of narrative. It's an expression that comes largely from the same source that my speech comes from. I don't see much of a separation between, how I communicate through music and how I communicate through words. I personally don't. But more to the point, I know that perhaps some of you are looking for something slightly more technical. So I will show you a couple of examples of what I do both with pitch and with rhythm to develop them, or to at least to put them into motion, because really development for me is something that happens as I write the piece and is largely intuitive. The way I work is I create a germ, I set it in motion, and then I just follow its thread. And following its thread is highly intuitive, and it's what I do just every day when I sit down and work on it. But there is no systematic or pre-compositional approach to doing that. I have a bag of tricks, of course, that over many, many, many years I have, accumulated, and those come in handy every time I work, but I don't consider them part of a system. And this applies to both my use of pitch and my use of rhythm. So I will share my screen again. So like I showed you with the Cuba Libre Soggetto Cavato, in this case, I started with something even simpler. This was originally going to be a piece for piano and flute only. And like most of my work since about, I would say, almost 20 years ago, it has this mechanistic interest. So I take these notes and I literally play with them. I rearrange them in various ways, and I segment them in a way that seems to give me something that, to me, at the onset of this process, seems logical. And then I activate them by doing things like what you see here after machine number one. I take, in this case, I segmented the original chromatic scale into two sections. And I then presented them separately. One I gave to the flute, which is the top line that you see here, and the other one I gave to the piano. And I simply rotated them the way that Stravinsky would do it with his hexachords. So the first trichord here in the piano is what you see in where do you see? Here. Yeah, as B. I'm sorry. And then you have a different rotation of that, as many rotations as are possible, and then I start over. And then the remaining notes, which are just three notes, I gave to the flute, and I also rotate them over different registers. Then I apply a filter, as I call them, that gives me different registers. So each rotation introduces a note in a new register. So in this case, low, high, low, middle, low, high, low, high, low, high, etc. It was supposed to be an alternation, but I introduced an anomaly here by having one note in what I call the middle register. And that gave me a shape that is a little bit more interesting. Already I have a layer that represents the rotations of these three notes in the same register, but then I have a layer that represents like an isorhythmic collection of different registers, high and low. And at the same time, I have this, again, almost isorhythmic enlarged set of rotations of the remaining notes that I give to the flute. And then that's basically how I activate this. And let me play the beginning of that first realization. That's just, basically the final realization of this system here, in which 16th notes are regular, but what gives the music a sense of rhythm is, number one, the displaced accents, and number two, the displaced register. So instead of just hearing ba 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 ba, you hear it's still 16th note pulsation, but because of the register and the displaced accents, it has an element of rhythmicity to it. I didn't invent this. This is, again, part of my bag of tricks. Then this is another piece that I wrote a long time ago, and this is back when I actually worked with extensive sketches. So this is for a piece called Son del Corazón, and this is just the rhythmic sketch for a bass solo at the beginning of the piece that pretty much triggers the whole thing. I heard of this as some sort of a walking bass type of thing, and the way I put it together was, first I started with, in that case, this collection of notes. It's basically a dodecaphonic series. I don't think I thought of it as a serial set, but it could have used that way. I certainly divided it into hexachords. So the first one, I'm sure that somebody like Bob would immediately tell me what the relationship between these two hexachords is. I was not thinking of that at the time, I don't think. But what I did was I created a kind of magic square or matrix that gave me the rhythm. 2, 3, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, etc. And then I just follow this, shortening it eventually as the music repeated. And that gave me the rhythm. So between the C and the F sharp, there were two 16th notes. Between the F sharp and the B, there were 3, then 1, 1, 1, 2, etc. And I just follow this. And this is what gave me this figure, etc. Etc. Which sounds almost like a walking bass. You can ignore this shadow thing for now. But so the rhythm ultimately is this, which I created in this sort of voodoo way, in this completely arbitrary way, following this matrix. I don't remember what gave me these numbers, but it was something. I just don't remember what it was. And again, this is not telling you how I develop rhythm. It's telling you how I ignite it, how I set it to motion. And then after that, I just play with it in all the different ways that we are taught that we can play with rhythm. I sometimes insert an additional note in the sequence. Sometimes I superimpose this rhythm with an augmented version of itself. Sometimes I reverse it. I play it in inversion or retrograde inversion even. I insert rests like I did here, for example, and this is when this shadow becomes handy now. For example, this is a rhythm that comes before the full presentation of the bass takes place, and I consider it a shadow, and it basically amounts to my deleting every other note. So it's bam, bom, dam, bim, dom, bim, bam, bom, dim, and that has a rhythm of itself, because the note values of this original rhythm were not regular. The shadow is not regular either. It has its own kind of personality. So these are the kinds of things that I do. Sometimes, again, this is something I borrow clearly from, mostly from Messiaen. I add the node values, I remove, I insert, I invert, I expand via augmentation and diminution. Those kinds of procedures I find myself doing constantly, but rarely in a systematic way, at least not anymore. I perhaps did when I was younger and I needed that more. Now, all of this is sort of like part of my system and I apply it a little bit more intuitively. And I'm sure that everybody who's watching this experiences that intuition is really nothing other than technique, assimilated technique, or internalized technique. So I'll just play what this sounds like. So that's basically how I create rhythmic structures. Now, you mentioned something about poetry. The reason why I was attracted to much of the poetry that I ended up using was rhythm. And you see this. For example, this piece which I used in Spanish in the opera, el no inóvulo, el no nonato, el no pos lodocosmos de impuros ceros noes que noan, y noan, y prulimono noan, al morbo amorfo no. Even in English it makes sense. The no inovulate, no, the no show, no, the no pos ludocosmic soup of zeros, no. It has its wonderful rhythm, and of course it's in a way nonsensical, and it's mostly driven by phonetics and by the rhythm of the words and all of that. But I'm attracted to this kind of thing. This one as well. Hay un hoyo en el poema. Hay un hoy en el poema. Hay un yo en el poema. Hay un o en el poema. Hay un en el poema. That's rhythm. In English, there's a hole in the poem. I had to, of course, modify it because it's impossible to translate directly. But there's a hole in the poem. There's a hole in the poem. There's a who in the poem. There's a halo in the poem. There's a in the poem. That's rhythm, and in this case, by a combination of permutation and omission. Ultimately, and this could have gone for a long time.
And these poems these really fit with the observation the student made of like repetition, but always changing something. Just and it changes the rhythm, but only slightly, and you're always getting something new.
I Stravinsky. That's what he does. Bartok, Stravinsky, that's exactly what they do. There's literal repetition, but rarely, most of the time, it's repetition with a twist, Mm-hmm.
Your music.
Okay. Well, I first encountered him, not him, but his work. I was doing something at MIT with the orchestra there. And I had an afternoon free, so I went to the MIT Museum and several of his works are on display there because he was for a while the artist in residence at MIT. And I saw these incredible little machines that moved, and I was just blown away by it. And I wrote down on a little piece of paper, Arthur Ganson. And then shortly after that, I was mugged in New York City, and my wallet was taken. And in that wallet was a little paper that said Arthur Ganson. And I lost the little paper, unfortunately. But of course, I knew Arthur Ganson, and I had admired his work. But I had not seen much of it since that first encounter. And then I think I was looking for something else on the internet, and I discovered that he had just published a DVD of his sculptures. So I immediately bought it, and I just was completely overwhelmed, not just by the sculptures, which are phenomenal and incredibly powerful, but the way he filmed them in motion was incredibly eloquent and compelling. So I thought I have to do something with this. I have to do something with this. So I a bunch of pieces based on sculptures. And then I wrote to him and I said, hey, I admired your work for a long time, and I just wrote some pieces based on your work. And would you be interested in coming to Eastman and work with the students? And he wrote immediately and said that he would be thrilled. He was immediately responsive. He came to Eastman and he premiered, and he was at the premiere of these pieces of mine, and also of 12 pieces that composers from Eastman wrote, inspired by his sculptures. He even brought one of his nicest ones, the most portable ones. It's a machine with a yellow chair, and it was on display in the lobby of Kilburn Hall. And so we had this big event with Arthur Ganson. It was one of the very first events that we had as the Warren Benson series, which is now unfortunately defunct. But so here, that's how. And then I wrote a bigger piece for orchestra that again explored his work, and he came again. He went to the premiere. And we became friends, and now we went to his wedding, and we are constantly in touch. And he's just like his art. He is a man of incredible scientific intelligence, but whose emotions are on display 24 hours a day. He just cannot hide his emotions. So the day we met, he told me the story of his then, the fact that his child was not living with him at the time, and he was very sad about it. And he started crying in the middle of a coffee shop, and we had just met in person. So this is how emotional this person is, and yet he's capable of creating these intricate machines that only an engineer with skill could be able to create successfully. So that's the origin of my fascination with Arthur Ganson. It began as fascination, pure fascination, and it's now a very, very beautiful friendship. It doesn't happen often, I don't think, that one admires an artist, meets the artist, and it turns out that the artist is a beautiful person. Most of the I know it's a terrible composition lesson to say that so much of what I do is a product of haphazard decisions or occurrences or intuition. I know that people want lessons, and but the fact is that so much in composition really is the product of things that we don't have that much control over, at least not the conceptual part. The work is different, but the work is not something that one can always explain clearly. And I think that's what's behind this sort of like evasive rendition of my work habits. It's not. I didn't grow up in a family of musicians. I don't have that sort of background. I'm not like so many Eastman students. Somebody who, has played the piano since age 4 and that has grown with the repertoire. My upbringing was very much not like that. I grew up reading books and looking at art and all of that, but certainly not in a musical family, in a musical environment. And therefore, my thinking as a composer comes from my upbringing, not from what I learned afterwards. You see, it comes from the fact that I grew up reading stories and making sense of them and looking at terrifying pictures by Goya and trying to make sense of them and what they meant and feeling and having a dialogue with those. And that's really what feeds my narrative, not so much my knowledge of the repertoire, which came later, of course, but that's not what's at the essence of my compositional outcome.